Rain hitting the windshield, wiper blades swiping left and right, the palpable humidity of the stormy night diffusing into the cabin as you drive along. Driving is relaxing, especially when the road is straight and the passers-by are few. Trees all around are a bonus, but when the gas light blinks on and you realize you're a bit too far from the nearest gas station, you think maybe you should have brought your phone along. Now, you're moments away from being stranded on the side of the road in the dark, with nothing but the rain and the cold. But maybe, just maybe, if you're lucky, or very unlucky, something else might happen upon your broken down car and keep you company. Enjoy these driving horror stories. If you have a scary story of your own and you want a chance to have it narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear some alone at night stories. Now, let's begin. The Arkansas Story from Ronin 316. I found myself heading from northwest Indiana to Houma, Louisiana on a Friday evening. I'd set out sometime in the afternoon. My best friend at the time had made an agreement with his ex-wife to come get his eldest daughter over Thanksgiving weekend, and this was the return trip to take her home. I should mention here that this occurred in the early 2000s, and I was in my early 20s. My friend, who for this story I'll refer to as D, was a truck driver and had been OTR, or over the road, the last few days. So the agreement was I would start the drive and he would sleep. Then when he woke up, we'd stop somewhere and swap. His daughter, who was around 7 at the time, quietly played on her Game Boy for the first few hours, before falling asleep in the back of my Blazer. I found myself driving down either I-55 or 57, I can't remember, when around 3 a.m., D started to wake up. He asked me how the drive was going. I told him it was fine. He glanced in the back to see his daughter sleeping, then asked me what state we were in. I told him Arkansas. He nodded. Then he watched as a couple mile markers went by. He told me there should be a rest stop ahead a few miles. Then we could stop and stretch our legs. Then he would take over driving. I nodded, and we conversed about nothing until the exit sign for the rest stop came into view, within a few miles, just like he said. Now, I was driving fast. Not insanely fast, but maybe 80 or so. When the exit came around, I took it, not really slowing down. Immediately, I noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was exactly. Coming around a curve, I was met with the concrete divider that separates residential and commercial vehicles. It was then I realized that the problem was none of the pole lights that lined the ramp were on. So it was pitch black, and I hadn't seen the divider due to the curve. D grabs his oh crap handle and starts pumping imaginary brakes, and I veer hard to the left, barely missing the divider, narrowly avoiding killing us all. I slow way down, easing into the residential parking side, where again there are no operable lights, and notice the entire lot is full with the exception of one parking space. The very first one you can take, actually. I park as D comments on the power apparently being out, and we sit there for a moment, coming down from the adrenaline rush that was us nearly dying in a fiery car crash. He glances back at his daughter, who somehow managed to remain sleeping while I sent her thrashing about the back of the Blazer. D then looks to me and says, "You go first. I'll stay with her, and when you come back I'll take her and we can get back on the road." I nod and go to shut off my vehicle, when my hand reaches my keys and just hangs there for a moment. Now, one thing you gotta know about me is I never, ever, and I mean ever, leave my keys in the vehicle. Can't stand it, don't like it. I have this weird thing that if I'm not in it, I want my keys on me. Not sure why. Nothing has ever happened for me to have cause for this. Just one of my quirks, I guess. So as I sat there with my hand on the ignition key, D goes, "You alright, man?" I shake my head a bit and reply, Yeah, I'm just gonna leave it running." Now, my buddy knows me, and he knows about this particular quirk of mine, but he just shrugged and said all right. What I didn't tell him was that I had just had this weird feeling that if I shut it off, it wouldn't start. Which made no sense, as the vehicle was perfectly sound and had never given me cause to have that particular worry. I hop out, and like I said, we were in the very first parking spot. So we were on the far end of the restrooms, specifically the women's side, as it turned out. So I had to walk to the other side to get to the men's. Instead of walking down the sidewalk, I opted to cut across the grass. It was shorter. As I'm walking, I figure that if none of the lights in the parking lot are working, odds are none of the electric is on inside the restrooms either. It's not a problem per se. I don't scare easily, and I prefer the dark over daylight. Also, I grew up in a haunted house and had my fair share of creepy experiences. Ghost stories? I got tons of them. The point I'm getting to is that while I believe in the paranormal and the likes, it takes more than a dark room to get under my skin. So, as I approach the men's room, I resign myself to this fact, opening the door. Sure enough, it's dark in there too. I sigh, but notice that the moon is out and full, and with its light I can get a basic idea of the layout of the bathroom with the door open. The door, however, is spring-loaded, so it would close behind me, but at least I had a heading for when I went in. I go to step inside, and, my hand to God, my feet refused to move. So I stood there at the threshold, trying to will my legs to work again, but they wouldn't. Someone might as well have nailed my feet to the ground. I tried in vain for a few moments to take the next step into the room, getting angry at myself for not being able to, while becoming increasingly embarrassed by how dumb I must have looked standing there, when, for reasons that lack all rationale, I think to myself that the lights are motion sensitive. Maybe I just need to go in far enough and they'll turn on. A shot in the dark, I know. And being an electrician by trade, I knew the odds were hard against me. But it was a guess. Not enough to get my legs working, mind you, so instead I settled on holding on to the door jamb with one hand, while waving my other hand inside, trying to catch the attention of a motion sensor that, deep down, I knew didn't exist. A few moments of this, and I am inwardly admonishing myself for looking so foolish, when, to this day, I still don't know why, I became immediately terrified. Just like with my vehicle, I had this sudden and overwhelming feeling that if I didn't get my hand out of that room, something I couldn't see was going to grab it, yank me inside, and that would be the end of me. As fast as I could, I ripped my arm from the door and closed it while putting my back into it. With every ounce of strength I had, I dug my boots into the concrete, waiting for whatever monster my imagination had conjured to shoulder check the door from the other side. I was sweating, breathing hard, growing tired from the fear and exertion. Did anything happen? No. I stood there looking ridiculous, until I finally let off the door and stood to face it one last time. As I stood there, I chuckled at my own stupidity, and shook my head at the thought that this is the kind of stuff that scares other people, not me. Nonetheless, I came to two very simple revelations in that moment. 1, there is no way in 10 hells I'm going into that bathroom, and 2, I'm a guy. Any tree will do. Fortunately, the rest stop was nestled in a wooded area, so my options were vast and varied. I find a nice-sized oak out of the way and walk over to it. I go around the back and proceed to take care of business. This puts me directly between the thick oak and the woods, so of course I get the feeling that I'm being watched. I'm just over this whole thing at that point, so I say out loud and to no one, "I'm sorry your life is so boring that you have to resort to watching a guy use the bathroom." I say this as I'm finishing up, and as I come back around the tree facing the entire parking lot of 30-ish cars, I freeze. I stood there, the smile from my poor attempt at humor fading fast as my blood ran cold. For the life of me, I have no idea how or why it took me so long to notice this. Maybe it was the initial rush on our arrival. Maybe it was my tunnel vision of contending with the dark bathroom. I don't know. But there I stood, looking over a sizable parking lot full of cars, mine the furthest away, and there wasn't a single soul around. Not one other person to be found. 30+ empty cars. No one walking their dog, no one stretching their legs, not one single other person anywhere. I thought I had to be missing something, so I looked all around in every direction, but there was nothing. And it was quiet, as if the world around me was holding its breath. It was one of the weirdest, most unnerving moments of my life. I took a breath, and I started to make my way back to the vehicle. Only this time, I opted to take the sidewalk, so I could see into most of the cars parked in front. Yet still, they were all empty. And while I understand that having a car seat doesn't demand that one is traveling with a child, some of the other bits and bobs and accoutrements strongly suggested it. When I got back to my vehicle, I got in, and before I closed the door, Dee told me in a tone that was very unlike him that we needed to get the heck out of there. I wasted no time, peeling out of the parking lot as fast as the Blazer would go. We ended up finding a truck stop and stopping there for facilities, snacks, and drinks. I don't remember why, but I continued driving, and after his daughter fell back to sleep, unaware of the entire rest stop excursion, Dee finally asked me what I experienced. I told him, and when I was finished, he told me that like me, and despite any explanation as to why it took him so long, he noticed the same thing. Except for him, it was the trucks in the commercial lot that got his attention. He said he had the window down so he could smoke, when he noticed none of the trucks were running. I didn't see the relevance in that, but he explained to me that truckers don't often shut their rigs off unless they are leaving them. If they're parking for the night or out of hours, they often leave them running to power TVs, game consoles, or whatever form of entertainment they have. Not to mention AC or heat for the night. When he didn't see any truckers in their cabs, filling out their logbooks or walking around, talking to loved ones on their phones, he started really paying attention. That was about the time I started back toward the truck myself. When I got back to my door, he was, as he put it, thoroughly unnerved. We continued to Houma without further incident. We dropped off his daughter and spent some time there so he could see his younger daughter. Left there and we stopped for a genuine po' boy that was fantastic. Then we were off to Mississippi so I could meet a lady friend of mine that I'd met online. We spent about 6 hours there and had a lovely time, minus a small misunderstanding where her father pulled a gun on me. It was fine. She pulled one on him and diffused the situation. It really is like a whole other world down south. We were on the Gulf, so I asked if Dee minded if we stopped by the ocean. I'd never been to one, and I didn't know if we'd have another chance to again. Not for nothing, but I'm 40 as of July this year, and I haven't been back to an ocean since, so good call, I guess. After an hour or so there, I'd been awake for something like 34 hours. D told me to crash and he'd start the long drive back. It was still light out, but I crawled into the back of my Blazer and passed out. Some undeterminable time later, I awoke to D screaming, Dude, wake up!" In my sleep-addled state, I sat up and asked him what was going on. It was dark out by this time, and he told me to look out the window. I did, and I saw red and blue lights on the other side of the highway. They were everywhere. Had to be a couple dozen patrol cars, all in a row bunched up in one area. You could also see at least 2 choppers flying around in circles above them. I asked if there was some sort of bad accident. I'll never forget his response. He said to me, "No, dude, we're in Arkansas. That's the rest stop." A few years later, I had to tell this story in front of a literature class. After I finished, I started to leave when a few of the students raised their hands. I looked at the professor. She nodded, so I pointed at one of them. It was a guy who had a question. I don't remember what it was, but I answered. Then another question, and another. Finally, a woman raised her hand and I pointed at her. She said, "And?" I said, "And what?" She replied with, "And you never found out what happened?" I regarded her for a moment before replying. The way I figure it, this story ends in one of 2 ways. Best case scenario. After state and local authorities received multiple reports of abandoned or otherwise unattended vehicles at rest stop such and such, an extensive search of that spot and surrounding areas turned up the gruesome discovery of corpses stacked like firewood in the woods. That's the best case scenario. Option 2, after state and local authorities received multiple reports of abandoned or otherwise unattended vehicles at the rest stop, an extensive search of that spot and surrounding area was conducted. After putting forth countless man-hours, personnel, and resources, they found absolutely nothing. Either way, I don't need to know that badly. Feathers and Fangs from SemiControlledChaos. Let me begin by saying these stories come from my family, so they are not my own personal stories, rather stories that have been told to me. Both of these tales happened at night on or just after hunting trips. The first happened to my father and cousin. One night, they decided to go frog gigging along the back roads of the hunting club they were in. My father said the night was uneventful for the most part. They hadn't even seen another car drive by that night. That was a bit odd, as it was one of the club's main roads. Anyway, they managed to fill an ice chest with frogs, so they started back towards home. On the drive there, they started to notice something. Eyes glowing in the trees. Not just a single pair, not even a dozen pairs. My father swears to me that there were so many eyes, he wasn't even able to count them all. Then the next thing he knew, there were owls in the road, flying around his truck. He said there were so many owls that they surrounded the truck and even started to attack it. They would fly headfirst into the windshield, clawing at the sides. Both he and my cousin were terrified that one of the owls may eventually be able to break the glass, and if that happened, they worried they wouldn't be able to keep the owls out. My father says he had to slow the truck to a crawl. Not by choice, mind you, but the owls were so thick in the air that he couldn't see the road ahead of him. They had to crawl along at around 5 miles per hour for about 3 miles. The entire time, these owls never let up the assault on the truck, scratching, pecking, and body slamming it from all directions. Eventually, the birds let up, and my father and cousin were able to speed up, leaving the swarm of angry claws and flapping wings behind them. To this day, no one but me seems to believe it. My cousin doesn't even talk about it anymore because he's tired of people calling him a liar about it. Which seems odd, given what happened to him just a few years later. It happened in the same area. He and some friends had once again gone frog gigging. It was much of the same. A particularly uneventful night where they got a decent amount of frogs. But once again, on the way back to the truck to go home, they started to hear something. A long howl. My cousin and his friends recognized it as a coyote howl. They paid it no mind and kept walking. But then there was another howl. This time it was from behind them. It hadn't even been 10 seconds after the first. Then more and more howls came. Slowly at first, from different directions, but quickly picking up by the second. My cousin and his buddies were more than spooked at this point, because these howls sounded like they were coming from all around. They kept increasing in number and volume until, from what my cousin says, it sounded like an air raid siren. He and his buddies dropped the chest and booked it back toward the truck. The whole way back, the sound of howling never died down. It stayed with them, and they could hear things rustling in the bushes all around them. Keep in mind it was dark, and from what he says, they were too scared to use the light they had, because they were in panic mode. As a result, they never actually saw any of the coyotes. My cousin, however, says that once he was within 20 feet of the truck, a howl came from right in between him and the truck, meaning one of these creatures was blocking their way to the vehicle. My cousin, in a panic, threw his frog gig in the direction of the howl. He then heard a high-pitched yelp, and he kept going until he reached the truck. Once they were all inside, they sped off, and, to my knowledge, they hadn't gone back since. Some context I later found out about the area. I think it's located near a Native American burial ground in Dixie County, Florida. The road it's on is known as the Bowlegs Road because of the Native American chief being buried there, Billy Bowlegs, I believe. So perhaps, just perhaps, the spirit chief is causing these odd behaviors in the animals there. So watch out if you ever find yourself on those back roads at night. Something Eating Roadkill, from Samsweeney. At the time, I was 22. I was in the Air Force, stationed at Creech Air Force Base. If you want a visual to the story, look up Creech Meteor on YouTube. That might be important later. Anyhow, I was driving my truck with 4 50-pound sandbags to whom I thought would be my brother-in-law's house in Indian Springs, which was right across the highway from Creech Air Force Base. He was engaged to my sister, and I had no problem picking up some sandbags and driving up to him. He was trying to DIY a basement. Now, Highway 95 doesn't seem dangerous, but it runs right through the Mojave Desert, and it's a straight 45-minute drive. It was winter, so even though it was only 8:30, it was pitch black out. I was nearly to my destination when the sky lit up green. If you look up that Creech Meteor video, it's in black and white, but had that video been in color, you would have seen something bright green. I pulled over to try and get a video of it, but I failed. I got back in the truck and back on the road. But then I saw the subject of this story. At first, it looked like a man in a hat and a trench coat. He was bent over a dead dog on the side of the road. I was an aspiring military working dog handler at the time, so I pulled over to see if I could offer my help. As soon as I got out of the car, the figure stood up and stared at me. This figure had the face of a coyote and bright green eyes. I wish I could say I fought it or screamed, but I ducked behind my truck and froze. I swear if I hadn't used the bathroom before, I would have wet myself when I heard that click-clack of canine paws hitting the ground. It was approaching me. I felt the hot breath of an animal breathing on my neck, but I stayed frozen. After a while, I heard it walk away, but the chewing sounds resumed. I got back in my truck and floored it, and I stayed the night at my destination. I've seen gruesome accidents, but this was the most afraid I've ever been on the road. A Scary Drive Home, from Mary H. This happened to me over 20 years ago, somewhere in Maine, but the details are still very clear in my mind. Halloween is my absolute favorite holiday, and I love decorated houses, businesses, etc. While driving somewhere, I'll usually pull over and park to look at every detail of a well-decorated location. On this particular occasion, I was driving on a back road around 11:30 p.m. on a cold October night. It would have been very near to the 31st. As I went by this house, I noticed a graveyard scene that looked interesting, with a low ground fog that added a spookiness and reality to the scene. I pulled over and sat with my car idling, as it was cold out, to look at this wonderfully decorated front yard. It was an elaborate graveyard scene, complete with body parts strewn about, bodies hanging from trees, lots of gravestones, bats, rats, skeletons, and some graves, which were partially dug open with zombie hands and heads looking as if they were digging themselves out of the graves. It was very quiet and very eerie, excellently and painstakingly done with lots of details, even including inscriptions on the gravestones. While I was sitting there quietly, enjoying every moment and joyfully noting every detail, suddenly a man with a mask leapt out from behind a gravestone, started an actual chainsaw, and ran, and I mean fast, right towards the car. He was dressed like Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2, with a dirty pillowcase with eye holes for a mask, and overalls with a flannel shirt. I sat there for a moment, stunned and shocked as I never expected this, then took off like a shot down the road. He chased my vehicle for a while, and when it was clear he wasn't going to catch up, he just stood there in the middle of the road, smoke coming from the chainsaw, still running. He watched me drive away. As I think back to this event, I have several questions. I recall that the house itself was totally dark, no lights on anywhere, save for one outside lantern to shed light on the scene. There were no vehicles in the driveway, and it seemed as if no one was home. So I'm thinking, this dude is just sitting there in the dark, in the cold, late at night, nearly midnight, just hoping a vehicle would happen to drive by on this rural back road. Wasn't he cold? There weren't any other vehicles on the road. How did he know I was coming? Did he know that I would pull over to sit for a few minutes looking the scene over? Did everyone who went by do that? How long was he out there before I came by, and wasn't he uncomfortable, just kneeling or crouching behind the gravestone that long? The idea that someone would go to all that trouble, just hoping that someone would drive by and stop long enough for him to come out running with a chainsaw in hand, that idea is in itself freaky. Was it really a prank? Or was it some demented soul who was looking for a chance to do something more than just scare under the guise of a Halloween scene? I'm glad I'll never find out, and just accept that he was looking for a harmless scare. But who really knows?